The Great Hall of the Galactic Assembly was the largest structure ever built by intelligent beings. It floated in the empty space between three ancient star systems, a monument to cooperation that had stood for over 50,000 years. Inside its crystal walls, representatives from 342 species gathered to decide the fate of the youngest member of their community, Admiral Katie. Morgan stood in the observation gallery high above the main floor. She wore her dress uniform, dark blue with silver trim. The same uniform her grandmother had worn when humanity first made contact with alien life. That had been 112 years ago. Katie had been a young officer then, full of hope and wonder at the universe that had suddenly opened before her species. Now she felt only cold certainty. Beside her stood Ambassador Lucas Hartley, a man who had spent his entire adult life building bridges between Earth and the stars. His hands gripped the railing so hard that his knuckles had turned white. His face showed the strain of weeks without proper sleep. Below them, High Arbiter Zyrith of the Velanthi Dominion raised his seven-fingered hand. The Velanthi were an ancient species, their civilization already old when humans were still learning to make fire. Zyrith had lived for over 3,000 years. He had seen species rise and fall. He had cast judgment on dozens of worlds. Today he would cast judgment on Earth. The holographic display above the central platform flickered to life. Numbers appeared in the cold blue light that the assembly used for official proceedings. Katie did not need to read them. She already knew what they would say. 312 votes for Exile, 28 votes against, 2 abstentions. Earth had been found guilty. The charges had been read out over the past 3 weeks. Humanity bred too quickly, doubling their population in times that other species found alarming. They were aggressive, their history filled with wars and conflicts that made peaceful species uncomfortable. They were unpredictable. Their scientists making discoveries that seemed to come from nowhere. They had uplifted 3 species without permission, teaching primitive beings to reach for the stars before the assembly had approved such contact. They had colonized 17 worlds in 2 centuries, spreading across space at a rate that no other species had ever matched. They adapted to environments that should have killed them. They modified their own bodies in ways that the assembly considered dangerous. And worst of all, they showed no signs of slowing down. Zyrith spoke, his voice carrying through the translation systems that allowed all species to understand each other. His words were calm and measured, the words of someone who had delivered such verdicts many times before. Exile, effective immediately. The Sol system would be quarantined. All human vessels currently beyond the boundary of their home system would surrender to coalition authorities. No human ship would be permitted to leave Earth's solar system. No alien ship would be permitted to enter. The quarantine would last for 10,000 standard cycles, approximately 12,000 Earth years. By the time it ended, everyone currently alive would be long dead. Their children would be dead. Their grandchildren, their great-grandchildren, dozens of generations would live and die under the quarantine. Earth would be alone. Lucas made a sound beside her, something between a sob and a curse. Katie did not react. She had prepared for this moment. She had hoped it would not come, but she had prepared. She reached into her pocket and activated the small communication device hidden there. It connected to a secure channel that bounced through 17 relay stations before reaching its destination. She spoke 3 words: "Execute Protocol Horizon." Lucas grabbed her arm. His eyes were wide with shock and something that might have been fear. He asked what she had done. Katie met his gaze without flinching. She told him that she had done what they had prepared for. She asked if he really thought humanity would let itself be caged. Below them, the assembly session was concluding. Representatives were already leaving, returning to their ships, their worlds, their lives. For them, this was simply another piece of business completed. Another threat contained. Another danger neutralized. They had no idea what they had just set in motion. On Earth, in a facility buried 3 miles beneath the Rocky Mountains, General Daniel Cooper received the transmission. He was an old man now, his hair gray, his face lined with the weight of secrets he had carried for decades. He had built this facility. He had recruited the scientists who worked here. He had overseen the construction of machines that no alien eye had ever seen. He closed his eyes for a moment. He thought of his children, his grandchildren, the world above that had no idea what was about to happen. Then he opened his eyes and addressed the room. The room was filled with officers and scientists, men and women who had dedicated their lives to a project that most of humanity did not know existed. They had worked in secret for 15 years. Ever since the first signs appeared that the assembly might turn against Earth, Daniel told them that they were no longer members of the galactic community, but they had never needed permission to reach for the stars. He gave the order to activate the Exodus fleet. Across 6 continents, things began to happen. In the deserts of Australia, the ground split open to reveal vast underground hangars. In the mountains of South America, camouflaged doors rolled back from cliff faces. In the frozen wastes of Antarctica, heat bloomed beneath the ice as engines that had never been tested came to life. Ships rose into the sky. Not dozens. Not hundreds. Thousands. The assembly had estimated that. Humanity possessed fewer than 200 vessels capable of traveling between stars. They had been wrong. They had been very wrong. The ships were of human design, built with human hands, powered by engines that human scientists had developed in laboratories that alien scanners could not detect. They were not as elegant as Velanthy cruisers or as massive as hegemony battleships, but they were fast. They were tough, and there were so many of them. In orbit around Earth, the first wave of evacuees was already boarding. Families who had volunteered years ago, who had trained in secret, who had said goodbye to friends and relatives who thought they were simply moving to another city. Scientists carrying the accumulated knowledge of human civilization. Engineers who knew how to build anything from raw materials. Doctors, teachers, farmers, artists. Everyone humanity would need to start over. Katie Morgan watched from her place in the observation gallery as the assembly session ended. She would stay here, playing the role of defeated ambassador, buying time for her people. Lucas stood beside her, still shocked, still struggling to understand what was happening. She told him that the galaxy had made its choice. Now humanity would make theirs far away. The first ships began to move toward the edge of the solar system. They carried 10 million people. The advance wave of an exodus that would empty Earth of half its population before the Coalition Enforcement Fleet arrived. Humanity had been sentenced to exile. They had decided to exile themselves first, and they had no intention of being found. 3 weeks after the verdict, Coalition Enforcement Fleet 7 arrived at the edge of the Sol system. The fleet consisted of 200 warships drawn from a dozen different species, all united under the banner of galactic law. Their mission was simple: contain the humans, prevent any escape, establish the quarantine that would last for 12,000 years. Fleet. Commander Vorthax of the Hegemony sat in his command chair and reviewed his orders one final time. The Hegemony had volunteered to lead this mission. They were the greatest military power in the galaxy. Their warships feared across 1,000 star systems. Vorthax had personally conquered 3 worlds and supervised the containment of 2 species, deemed too dangerous for galactic civilization. Humans would be no different. His sensor officer made a sound of confusion. Vorthax turned to look at the display screen. What he saw made his 4 hearts skip their rhythm. The officer reported that he was detecting over 4,000 vessels leaving Earth's orbit. They were not using any known drive technology. He could not identify their propulsion method. Vorthax leaned forward. 4,000 ships was impossible. Coalition intelligence had confirmed that humans possessed fewer than 200 interstellar vessels. They were a young species, barely a century into their space age. They could not possibly have built such a fleet in secret. But the sensors did not lie. The human ships were accelerating. They would reach the quarantine perimeter in 6 hours. They were heading in all directions, spreading out like seeds scattered by the wind. Vorthax gave the order to intercept. His fleet began to move, their weapons charging, their shields activating. They were the finest warships in the galaxy. 4,000 primitive human vessels would not escape. On the bridge of the starship New Frontier, Captain Lisa Brennan watched the Coalition fleet scramble into formation. She was a small woman with gray eyes and steady hands. She had been a pilot before she was a captain, flying experimental craft that pushed the boundaries of what human technology could achieve. She had been chosen for this mission because she did not know how to panic. Her chief engineer, Samuel Green, monitored the displays at his station. He reported that the Coalition ships were powering their weapons. Lisa nodded. She told him to let them. By the time they fired, the human fleet would be long gone. She opened a channel to all human vessels. Her voice was calm and clear. She told them that they had trained for this moment. They knew what to do. On her mark, they would engage full drives and proceed to their assigned coordinates. She reminded them that they carried the future of humanity with them. She told them to make it count. She paused for a moment, then gave the order. Across the void, 4,000 human ships activated technology that the galaxy had never seen. The full drive did not push a ship through space like conventional engines. Instead, it folded space itself, bringing distant points together like creasing a piece of paper. One moment a ship was here. The next moment, it was somewhere else entirely. The Coalition fleet had no time to react. Their weapons fired into empty space. Their sensors screamed with confusion as thousands of targets simply vanished. In less than 60 seconds, the entire human Exodus fleet had disappeared. Vorthax stared at his empty tactical display. His communications officer was shouting about lost contacts. His weapons officer was demanding to know what had happened. His second-in-command was asking for orders. Vorthax had no orders to give. The humans were gone. Every single one of them. And the Coalition had no way to follow. He opened a channel to Galactic Assembly Command. His voice was hollow with shock. He reported that the humans had escaped. They had not fought. They had not tried to negotiate. They had simply left. And the Coalition had no idea where they had gone. The Assembly received the news with disbelief that quickly turned to fear. The humans had been sentenced to containment. Instead, they had scattered themselves across the galaxy like seeds in a storm. They could be anywhere. They could be everywhere. On Earth, those who remained watched the sky as the last of the Exodus fleet departed. Not everyone had chosen to leave. Some were too old for the journey. Some refused to abandon the world where they had been born. Some stayed because someone had to, because humanity needed a presence in their home system. A reminder that they had existed and would exist again. President Maria Delgado addressed the world from a podium set up on the lawn of what had once been called the White House. The old building stood behind her, a symbol of human governance that no longer had much meaning. She spoke to cameras that broadcast her words to every corner of the planet. She told them that they had been judged too dangerous, too ambitious, too human. They had been exiled from a community that feared their potential. So be it. The stars had never belonged to the Assembly to give or withhold. Humanity would find its own path. Humanity would build its own future. And perhaps someday, they would meet the galaxy again. On that day, the galaxy would see what Exile had truly created behind her. The final wave of ships rose into the darkening sky. They carried the last volunteers, the ones who had waited until the very end. Their destinations were scattered across a dozen spiral arms, coordinates chosen specifically so that no single disaster could find them all. In the weeks that followed, the Coalition established their quarantine. Automated stations ringed the solar system, watching for any ship that might try to leave. Patrol fleets made regular sweeps through the outer planets. Earth was monitored constantly, every transmission recorded, every movement tracked. The Assembly wanted to know where the humans had gone. They deployed their finest scientists to study the sensor readings from the Exodus. They sent probes to search the regions of space where human ships had disappeared. They offered rewards to any species that could provide information. They found nothing. The full drive left no trail. The human ships had scattered two coordinates so distant and so random that searching for them was like searching for specific grains of sand on a beach that stretched for light years. The galaxy was simply too big. And the humans had planned too well. Lisa Brennan stood on the bridge of the new frontier and watched a new star grow brighter in the view screen. It was a yellow sun, much like the one she had left behind. The planet they were approaching was rocky and cold, but it had water and atmosphere. With work, it could be home. Around her, the crew was already making plans. They would land. They would build shelters. They would start farms and factories and schools. They would raise children who would never see Earth, who would know their homeworld. It's only through stories and recordings, but those children would be free. Lisa thought about the galaxy they had left behind, the assembly that had condemned them, the coalition that had tried to cage them. They had expected humanity to submit. They had expected humanity to accept their judgment. They had not understood humans at all. The new frontier began its descent toward the new world. Behind it, 100 other ships followed, carrying the seeds of a civilization that refused to die. The exile had begun. But it was not an ending. It was a beginning. 200 years passed in the silence, between stars. The Galactic Assembly continued its slow and careful business. New species were discovered and evaluated. Trade routes expanded by small degrees. Wars were fought and settled according to ancient rules. The great powers rose and fell in cycles that had repeated for millions of years, and humanity became a ghost story. Young beings in schools across the galaxy learned about the exile as a cautionary tale. Here was a species that had reached too far too fast. Here was what happened when ambition exceeded wisdom. The humans had been given a chance to join civilized space. They had squandered it through their own reckless nature. Some said the exiled humans had died in the void. Their stolen technology had failed them, leaving millions of refugees to suffocate in the darkness between stars. It was a sad fate, but a fitting one. The galaxy was not meant for species that could not learn patience. Others whispered different stories. They said the humans lurked in the shadows at the edge of known space, building weapons, planning revenge. They said human scouts watched coalition patrols from hiding. They said that one day the exiles would return with fire and fury to punish those who had cast them out. A few optimists believed the humans had found peace somewhere far away. Perhaps they had discovered a region of space beyond the reach of the assembly. Perhaps they had built a quiet civilization where they could grow and change without interference. Perhaps exile had been a gift rather than a punishment. The truth was stranger than any of these. Stories researcher Corvath of the Systematic Collective had spent 40 years studying what he called the human phenomenon. His species were scientists by nature, driven to understand patterns and connections that others missed. He had collected every piece of data from the brief century of human contact with galactic civilization. He had interviewed hundreds of beings who had met humans. He had analyzed human art, human music, human literature, and he had reached conclusions that kept him awake through many nights. He stood before the Assembly Intelligence Committee in a small chamber far from the main hall. The beings who gathered here dealt with secrets and threats. They did not appreciate being summoned by a researcher with wild theories. Corvath told them what he believed. The humans had not fled to a single hiding place. They had dispersed deliberately, strategically, scattering themselves across the entire galaxy according to a plan made years before the exile. Every human vessel tracked before their disappearance had been heading to a different destination. They had not been running away. They had been seeding themselves like a plant, spreading its seeds across a vast field. Committee. Chair Yelindra of the Volanthe dismissed his concerns. She asked what scattered primitives could possibly accomplish. Without access to galactic trade networks, without manufacturing infrastructure, without the accumulated knowledge of civilized space, the humans would be starting from nothing. Even if some had survived, they would be too busy staying alive to pose any threat. Corvath activated a holographic display. A map of the galaxy appeared, showing the familiar spiral arms and the known territories of assembly species. Then he added another layer of data. The committee members grew very quiet. Thousands of tiny points of light appeared in regions that should have been empty. Dark zones that no one had bothered to explore. Spaces between stars where nothing of value existed. The points were scattered seemingly at random, but Corvath had studied them long enough to see the pattern. He told the committee that he had been monitoring these signals for 30 years. They were structured transmissions using frequencies that galactic civilization rarely bothered with. The signals had started small, just a few dozen sources. Now there were thousands, and the number was growing every year. He told them that the humans were talking to each other. They had built something in the darkness, and they no longer seemed interested in hiding. The committee debated what to do. Some wanted to send military forces to investigate. Others argued that provoking the humans, if they still existed in significant numbers, would be foolish. A few suggested that Corvath was simply wrong, that the signals came from natural phenomena or unknown alien species. While they argued, events moved faster than they could respond. 3 months after Corvath's presentation, a ship appeared at the edge of assembly space. It emerged from fold space without warning, something that should have been impossible. Only humans had ever demonstrated that technology. The ship was enormous. Coalition observers estimated it was 3 times the size of the largest hegemony battleship. Its hull was made of materials that their sensors could not identify. It broadcast a message in perfect Volanthi, the language of the Assembly's founding species. The message said that this was the human cooperative vessel Distant Shore. It requested permission to open diplomatic relations. It came in peace, but it no longer came as a supplicant. The Assembly convened an emergency session. Representatives who had thought the human problem solved 2 centuries ago found themselves facing a new reality. The exiles had returned, and they had clearly not spent their time in the wilderness weakened or diminished. Ambassador Grace Holloway walked into the Great Hall with the confidence of someone who had nothing to fear. She was tall and calm, her gray eyes taking in the assembled representatives of hundreds of species. Her great-great-grandmother, Katie, had stood in this same hall when humanity was condemned. Grace had studied recordings of that day many times. She stood at the central podium and waited for silence. It came slowly. Many species were shouting questions or protests. The hegemony representative was demanding that the intruder be arrested. The Velanthi were calling for order when she could finally be heard. Grace spoke simply and clearly. She told them that 200 years ago, this assembly had voted to exile her people. They had expected humanity to wither and die in the darkness between stars. Instead, humanity had built. They had explored. They had grown. She told them that the human cooperative now inhabited over 6,000 worlds, across territories that the assembly had never mapped. They had developed technologies that the galaxy could not replicate. They had learned patience during their long exile. And they had come to make an offer. High Arbiter Zyrith, ancient now and kept alive only by machines, leaned forward. He asked what offer the humans were proposing. Grace smiled. She told them that humanity was offering partnership. True partnership between equals. Humanity had resources that the assembly needed. They had knowledge that the assembly lacked, and they were willing to share if the assembly was willing to accept them as they were. She paused. Letting her words settle into the silence, she told them that humanity was no longer the desperate newcomers that the assembly had feared. They had become something else entirely. The only question remaining was whether the assembly could accept that reality. The hall erupted into chaos. Species that had not agreed on anything for centuries found themselves united in confusion. The galaxy had changed while they were not paying attention. Grace stood calmly at the center of the storm and waited. Humanity had returned, and nothing would ever be the same. The offer of partnership divided the Galactic Assembly in ways that had not been seen since the founding wars 20,000 years before. Some species saw opportunity. Human technology was clearly advanced in ways that could benefit everyone. Human medicine had apparently solved problems that galactic science still struggled with. Human manufacturing techniques produced goods faster and cheaper than traditional methods. Trading with humanity could make many species very wealthy. Others saw only threat. The humans had been exiled for good reason. They bred too fast, expanded too quickly, changed too readily. Allowing them back into civilized space would be like releasing a virus into a healthy body. Within a few generations, humans would dominate everything. It was simply their nature, and a few saw a chance to finish what the exile had started. Fleet. Master Dorvax of the hegemony gathered his war council in chambers hidden deep within his flagship. The hegemony had ruled through strength for 12,000 years. They had conquered dozens of species. They had crushed rebellions and eliminated threats. They had not become the greatest military power in the galaxy by showing mercy to those who challenged them. Dorvax told his admirals that the humans claimed peaceful intentions, but their very existence was a provocation. They had been exiled for their dangerous potential. Now they had proven that potential beyond anyone's worst fears. 6,000 worlds in 200 years. Technologies that made hegemony weapons look primitive. A population that had grown from millions to billions despite starting with nothing. He told them that if humanity was allowed to integrate with assembly space, they would dominate within a century. The hegemony's power would become meaningless. Everything they had built would crumble. They had to strike now while they still had a chance. His admirals agreed. Plans were made. Ships were gathered. The attack would be swift and decisive. A demonstration of hegemony power that would remind the galaxy who truly ruled the stars. The human diplomatic fleet had stationed itself. A trading post at the edge of assembly space. The distant shore floated peacefully beside a small escort of human vessels. They were conducting negotiations, meeting with representatives of species curious about human technology. They seemed completely unaware of the danger. Approaching 300 hegemony. Warships emerged from faster-than-light travel in perfect formation. They surrounded the human vessels within seconds, their weapons already locked on targets. Fleetmaster Dorvax opened a channel and demanded immediate surrender. Commander Nathan Brooks, captain of the distant shore, received the demand with remarkable calm. He was a middle-aged man with weathered hands and steady eyes. He had fought in 3 conflicts during humanity's expansion through the outer territories. He had faced pirates, natural disasters, and hostile alien life forms. A hegemony fleet did not particularly impress him. He had also been expecting this attack for months. Nathan told his crew to go out of stations. But instead of ordering weapons powered, he told them to deploy the response packages. The distant shore launched thousands of small objects into space. They were barely larger than a human fist, dark and nearly invisible against the black void. They spread outward in all directions, moving faster than any missile the hegemony had ever encountered. The hegemony ships began firing. Their weapons were the finest in the galaxy, capable of destroying small moons. They hit nothing. The response packages were too small, too fast, too numerous. They slipped through defensive fire like water through a net, and then they reached the hegemony holes. They did not explode. They did not burn or cut or smash. They simply attached themselves to the ships and went to work. Every hegemony vessel found its systems freezing one by one. Engines went silent. Weapons powered down. Navigation displays went dark. Life support remained functional, keeping the crews alive and comfortable, but completely unresponsive to commands in less than 5 minutes. 300 of the most powerful warships in the galaxy hung dead in space. Helpless as floating stones, Nathan opened a channel to Fleetmaster Dorvax. The hegemony commander's face appeared on screen, twisted with fury and something that looked very much like fear. Nathan spoke calmly. He told Dorvax that the hegemony had attacked humanity. Humanity could have destroyed their entire fleet. Every ship, every crew member, every weapon. Instead, humanity had chosen to demonstrate something important. He told Dorvax that humanity did not want war. Humanity did not need to kill in order to win. The hegemony ships would be released in 3 days. Their crews would be unharmed. But Dorvax needed to think very carefully about what came next, he told Dorvax that humanity had learned many things during their exile. They had learned patience. They had learned restraint. They had learned that victory meant nothing if it only created more enemies. But they had also learned that they would never again allow themselves to be victims. The transmission. The hegemony fleet drifted silently, unable to respond, unable to fight, unable to flee. And across the galaxy, other species watched and understood. Humanity was not just powerful. They were something entirely new. On Earth, President Marcus Holloway received news of the confrontation. Marcus was Grace's younger brother. Both of them descended from the original Katie Morgan, who had overseen humanity's exodus. He had been born on a colony ship between stars. He had grown up knowing that his people were exiles, outsiders, refugees. Now he led a civilization that spanned thousands of worlds. He contacted the Human Cooperative Council. Representatives from across human space appeared as holographic projections in his office. They had been expecting this moment. The hegemony had simply done what they always did when faced with something they could not control. Marcus told them that the hegemony had shown their hand. Others would follow. Species that had lived in fear for too long would try to strike at humanity while they still thought they could. The Council needed to accelerate their integration program. They needed to show the galaxy that humanity was not a threat to be feared, but a partner to be embraced. The program had been prepared for years. Human doctors were sent to worlds struggling with disease. Human engineers helped species build infrastructure they could not have created alone. Human teachers shared knowledge freely, asking nothing in return. And slowly, carefully, attitudes began to change. Within a year, 12 species had broken from the assembly to form direct trade agreements with humanity. They were smaller species, ones who had always lived in the shadow of the hegemony. They saw in humanity a chance for something better. Within 5 years, 60 species had joined them. Human technology spread across the galaxy, transforming everything it touched. Medical advances that had seemed impossible became commonplace. Energy systems that had taken centuries to develop appeared on world after world. The hegemony watched their empire of fear crumble. No one attacked them. No one challenged them directly. Humanity simply offered a better alternative, and species that had trembled before hegemony power suddenly found they had other options. Fleet. Master Dorvax was quietly removed from command. The hegemony leadership debated what to do, but they could not agree. Some wanted to launch a full-scale war. Others pointed out that humanity had already demonstrated it could defeat the hegemony without firing a shot in the end. They did nothing. And with each passing year, their power faded a little more. Grace Holloway continued her diplomatic work, building bridges that would last for generations. She often thought about her ancestors, about the fear and hope they must have felt when they launched into the unknown. They had been exiled for their potential. Now that potential was reshaping the galaxy, and humanity was only getting started. 500 years had passed since the exile, and the galaxy had transformed beyond recognition. The old Galactic Assembly was gone, replaced by something called the Galactic Union. It was not simply a new name for the same institution. The Union operated on principles that would have horrified the ancient powers. Here, a species that had been traveling between stars for only 50 years had the same voice as one that had done so for 50,000. Here, strength was measured not in warships but in contributions to common good. Here, the fear that had governed galactic politics for millions of years had finally begun to fade. Humanity had not conquered the galaxy. They had changed it. The being who had once been High Arbiter Xyrith no longer existed in any physical form. His body had failed centuries ago, but his consciousness had been preserved in the memorial archives of Velanthi Prime. His descendants brought visitors to speak with him occasionally. He was a relic of a vanished age, a living memory of how things had once been. Today's visitor was unusual. A human woman, tall and serene, with gray eyes that seemed to hold depths of experience impossible for such a young species. She had traveled a long way to meet him. Her name was Maya Sullivan. She was a historian who specialized in the period of the exile. She had come to speak with someone who had lived through it. Xyrith's holographic form flickered into existence. He had chosen to appear as he had been at his peak, strong and confident, the supreme arbiter of galactic law. But there was something in his simulated eyes that spoke of regret. Maya told him that he had been there at the beginning. He had cast the deciding vote to exile her species. Xyrith acknowledged this. He told her that he had believed he was protecting civilization. He had believed humanity was a virus that would consume everything it touched if not contained. He had thought exile was mercy, compared to the alternative that some species had proposed. Maya asked what alternative that had been. Zyrith was silent for a moment. Then he told her that some had wanted extinction, complete elimination of the human species. They had argued that exile was too risky, that humans would find a way to escape, that the only safe option was to end the threat permanently. Maya absorbed this information calmly. She asked Zirith how he felt now, looking back across 5 centuries. Zirith's form turned toward the window of his chamber. Outside, the sky above Velanthi Prime was filled with orbital habitats of human design. Ships of 100 different species moved in patterns of trade and exploration that would have been unimaginable 5 centuries ago. The world below had been transformed by technologies that humans had freely shared. He told Maya that he now understood he had been right about one thing. Humanity had consumed everything it touched. Their ideas, their energy, their restless drive to grow and change had spread across the galaxy like fire. Nothing had been left unchanged, but he had been wrong about what that meant. Consumption was not always destruction. Sometimes it was transformation. Humanity had not destroyed galactic civilization. They had made it into something new, something better, something that the old assembly could never have imagined. He asked Maya whether that was salvation or damnation. He told her he was no longer wise enough to say. Maya smiled gently. She told him that humanity had never been a virus. They had been a catalyst. And perhaps that was what the old powers had truly feared. Not that humanity would destroy their civilization, but that humanity would change it. That humanity would force everyone to become something new. She thanked him for his time and left. Him alone, with his preserved memories and his ancient regrets, in the great hall where humanity had once been condemned. The Galactic Union held its regular sessions. The hall had been modified over the centuries, expanded to accommodate new members, decorated with art from hundreds of worlds. But its purpose remained the same. Here, the intelligent species of the galaxy gathered to decide their common future. The Union faced challenges that the old assembly had never confronted. The careful, slow expansion of civilized space had become a bold push into regions that had been declared forbidden for millions of years. Ships explored territories that ancient maps had marked with warnings. Scientists studied phenomena that their predecessors had thought too dangerous to approach. New species were being uplifted constantly, taught to reach for the stars by mentors eager to share what they had learned. The old rules about waiting and observing and evaluating had been discarded. If a species wanted to join the community of star travelers, they were welcomed with open arms, and somewhere in the vast darkness between galaxies, something had been found that suggested the universe was far stranger and larger than anyone had ever imagined. Admiral Tyler Morrison stood on the observation deck of humanity's newest vessel. The ship was called the Far Horizon, and it was designed for a mission that no one had ever attempted before. It would cross the void between galaxies, traveling distances so vast that light itself took millions of years to make the journey. Tyler was not young. He had served in humanity's fleet for 60 years, working his way up from ensign to admiral through talent and dedication. He had commanded ships in a dozen different star systems. He had negotiated with species that communicated through colors, and ones that thought in mathematics. But this mission was different from anything he had done. Before, his crew represented 100 different species. Humans worked alongside Velanthi and Hegemony and dozens of others. They had trained together for years, learning to function as a single unit despite their differences. Some of them would not survive to see the journey's end. It would take generations, but their descendants would complete the mission. They would carry the light of intelligence across the greatest darkness anyone had ever crossed. Tyler addressed his officers. He told them that 250 years ago, the galaxy had voted to cage humanity. The ancient powers had feared what humans would become. They had been right to fear. He told them that humanity had become exactly what they had feared, a force of change, a catalyst that transformed everything it touched, a species that refused to accept limits, that always reached for the next horizon. But the ancient powers had been wrong about what that meant. He told his crew that humanity had never been a threat. They had been a door A door to possibilities that the galaxy had been too afraid to explore. A door to futures that the old assembly had tried to prevent. And now, together, they were going to see what lay on the other side. The engines of the far horizon hummed to life. The ship began to move, accelerating toward the edge of the galaxy. Behind it, thousands of other vessels maintained their positions. Waiting to receive whatever messages the explorer sent back, Tyler looked out at the stars. At the galaxy that had once tried to reject his kind. At the vast darkness that still held more mysteries than anyone could imagine. Humanity had been told they did not belong. Among the stars, they had answered by making the stars their home. They had been exiled for their dangerous potential. They had proven that. Potential beyond anyone's wildest dreams. And now, 500 years after a vote that was supposed to end their story, humanity was leading an entire galaxy into the unknown. The exile had not destroyed them. It had not even slowed them down. It had simply given them the freedom to become what they had always been meant to be. The far horizon crossed the boundary of the galaxy and kept going. Carrying the hopes of 1,000 species into the void between stars, humanity was still reaching. Humanity was still growing. Humanity was still changing everything it touched, and they were only getting started.